Hi, this is Job Aguas, and welcome to my lectures in Philosophical Anthropology. And this is now the third part of my lecture on man as an existential subject. And in this part, I will be focusing on man as an acting subject. Now, for this presentation, for this lecture, I will be um, focusing on the philosophy of Karl Wojtyła, who wrote a book entitled The Acting Person. Wojtyła, or John Paul II, uh, presented this book, or the book The Acting Person, in order to explain his idea about the person and action. And in general, for Wojtyła, the human person is a subject also. Is a subject, spiritual subject. And we can fully understand the nature of the human person as a subject, as a spiritual subject, through his actions or through his conscious actions. And he follows the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas in presenting the idea of the person and the action. So in this lecture, I'll be focusing on the action, right? And of course, from time to time, I'll be referring to his idea of what the human person is, right? According to St. Thomas, a human act or action is every action that proceeds from the deliberate free will of the human being. So it is a deliberate will, self-determined act for St. Thomas. Therefore, it is performed with the knowledge of the intellect and the free decision of the human will. So for St. Thomas, the highest, the highest faculty of man is the rational faculty, and therefore the action that is proper to man is an action that proceeds from the rational faculty. We have discussed, I think we have discussed that in some of our lectures in the class. Okay? So it is done, therefore, with knowledge, with freedom, and voluntariness. It is an act of which the human being is the master, whether the act begins and ends in the will. So, like loving, uh, or it begins and ends in the intellect, like thinking, or those that are commanded by the rational faculties, to other faculties like writing, speaking, walking, playing, discussing, etc., etc. Only human actions bear moral responsibility, according to St. Thomas. Others, or the other acts that we perform without the knowledge of the intellect or without the decision of the will, are called by St. Thomas as acts of man. There are acts that we do not do without, or we do without any deliberation or without any freedom. Okay? And this may include some of our bodily functions like absorption and assimilation of food, or our instinctive behaviors like our mannerisms, and those that happen during our unconscious or sleeping states. Okay? So, since they are not deliberate, they are not free, they are not voluntary, they do not bear moral responsibility. And because we are human persons, we are capable of those acts, both the willed and unwilled, voluntary and involuntary, conscious and unconscious. We are regarded as acting subjects. And because of our human acts, we bear responsibility, and therefore we are moral subjects. So we are acting subjects at the same time, moral subjects. Acting subjects because we are capable of those acts, and moral subject because some of those acts are human acts which bear responsibility. So let's focus now on man as the acting subject. Okay? So for Wojtyła, man is an active and a dynamic being because we are a man, we are a being fully in act. And our human dynamisms include all our functions and faculties. So like St. Thomas Aquinas, Wojtyła distinguishes two kinds of activities, or what he calls the human dynamisms. The first of the human dynamism is the human activity, which is similar to the human act defined by St. Thomas. But Wojtyła added a very important component to this act, and that is our consciousness. Of course, Wojtyła, although he was influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas, he was also influenced by phenomenology, specifically Max Scheler. And the phenomenologists, starting from Husserl, of course, emphasize the function of consciousness to the human person. So for Wojtyła, our actions are accompanied by consciousness. They're not just deliberate, they're not just will, they're not just, you know, emanating from our intellect. They are accompanied by conscious, they are conscious actions. So he calls this man acts. Okay, man acts. It proceeds from our rational faculty, especially the will. But more importantly, it is a conscious act, according to St. John Paul II. The other human activity is similar to the act of man, defined by St. Thomas, is not accompanied by consciousness, which means that those actions, right, they are not conscious, they are not willed, and he calls it something that simply happens. So there is the human act or the man act, and there is the something that simply happens. I don't know if that is the right translation of the post, but in the English translation of the text of Wojtyła, there is a distinction between acting and happening. Acting meaning conscious action, happening unconscious action. Okay, so we have functions or powers and actions that we are not conscious or aware of, or are not accompanied by our consciousness. We have functions or powers that that operate or simply happen even without us being conscious of them. The bodily operations and functions are simply happening even without us becoming aware of it. Of course, we are aware that when we eat food, the food is digested. But at the very moment that the digestion and absorption of food is happening, we are not conscious. It simply happens. Our mannerisms, for example, they simply happen. Are you conscious that you're always scratching your head every time, for example, you recite in the class? It's not. We are unaware of them, right? So while there are those functions or powers that are accompanied by our consciousness, meaning we are aware of them and we cause them to be, there are also those that simply happen or simply manifest without the accompaniment of our consciousness. Right? So these are the kinds of uh, two kinds of actions that Wojtyła is talking about: the acting and the happening. So the man acts is our fully human personal activity. There are those that are accompanied by our consciousness. These are conscious and determined, willed activities. So when we play, when we eat, when we write, when we sing, when we speak, okay, when we listen, not hearing, when we listen, right, when we recite, when we discuss, these are conscious actions. The something that happens, or something happens in man, are those that simply happen or operate even when we are not conscious of them. They reveal our passivity because they simply happen without the accompaniment of our consciousness. So while the actions, the acting, reveal our activity, those that simply happens reveal our passivity. Activity, passivity. So the body functions and our instinctive behaviors, they simply happen, they reveal our passivity. Okay. So the first activity is, the first activity is active, meaning acting, and the second is passive, simply happens. Through our conscious acts, we experience our activeness, And through those acts that simply happen, we experience our passiveness. Activeness, passiveness. Right? Now, the questions of, or the notion of the experience of efficacy and subjectiveness. Efficacy, subjectiveness. Right? So, when can we say that we are performing a conscious act? And when can we say that something is simply happening to us? According to Bitiwa, in performing a human and conscious act, we experience ourselves as the agent or the one who originates, the one who initiates, all right, the one who performs and cause the action to happen. We experience ourselves as the agent of the action. And when we experience ourselves as the agent, as the cause of the action, he calls this the experience of efficacy or the moment of efficacy, meaning we are the efficacious agent, we are the cause of the act. We are aware that we are the agent of the act. We bring the act to action, or do we bring the act to existence? So efficacy means the capacity to produce a result or an effect. So we are the agent, we are the cause, and our actions are the effect, the result. Okay? So if the act is our effect, then we experience ourselves as being the actor, the agent, the cause. So the experience of efficacy means that we have the experience of being this person who caused the act. Okay? We experience ourselves as the origin of the action. So when I speak, for example, as I give this lecture, I experience myself as the originator, as the cause, the agent who brings this lecture, this discussion into being. Right? So we are the ones who bring the action into being and we sustain it into its existence. So by experiencing ourselves as the cause of the action, we discover that we are completely involved in the act. And at the same time, we are the originator of the act. And since we are the agent of the act, it means that our conscious actions are also coming from us and we have to be responsible for them. Right? So I am conscious that I am the one giving the lecture. And I have to be responsible for whatever happens to this lecture, for example. Right? So that is the moment or the experience of efficacy. So when we perform an act, we're just conscious of our action, but also aware of our subjectivity. This awareness of our own subjectivity or our own self is what Wojtyła calls subjectiveness. This is the awareness of our own self. So the first one is we are aware that we are the agent of the act. But when we become aware that we are the agent of the act, we also become aware of ourselves not just as the agent, but as self. But not just as agent, but as self, as ego. So we are not just aware of ourselves as agent of the action, we are also aware as self. And this is related to our self-consciousness. That is, we are conscious of ourself as self. This is the consciousness of the person as a person. So you see, Wojtyła brings in two concepts here. First, the moment of efficacy enables us to know that we are the agent of the action, that we cause the action to existence. But by looking at us as the agent, we realize that we are not just the agent of the action, we realize that we ourselves. We become conscious of ourselves as persons. So for Wojtyła, human action gives us a good insight as to who we are as human persons. We understand ourselves as human persons because of our actions. Right? It is through our action that our subjectivity is revealed. Our actions have personal character because what is revealed here is the person. So, when we perform an action, our action has a value, which Wittiwa calls the personalistic value of the action. Because of the fact that it's the person who acts, the person or the act acquires a value that is almost equal or at par with the value of the person. That is the personalistic value of the person, right? Of course, we say that the human person has an inherent dignity and value and worth. Now, because the agent of the action is a person, and the person has an inherent value, then our action also acquires a kind of personal value because it's an action that is done by the person. It is a fundamental value which Wojtyła calls the personalistic value of the action. Labor or work, for example, as a human and personal act, has personal value. So the value of the person extends to the value or extends to the product of his work or the product of his labor. This lecture has a personal value because it's a lecture delivered by a human person. When you write your thesis, it has a personal value because it is a thesis done by a person. So it is an undeniable fact that the human work has a value that is almost similar to the value of the person. Now, the personalistic value is different from the moral value of the act because the moral value of the act will depend on whether the act is good or bad. And only good actions will have a moral value, a good moral value. But any act that is performed by man will have a personal value for the very reason that it is a an action performed by man. But the personalistic value is not the same as the moral value of the action. These are two different things, right? So this personal value of our action must be differentiated from the moral value because the moral value has reference to certain moral norms. The personalistic value is reference only to the very performance of the action itself by the person, in the very fact that we act in a manner that is appropriate to us as human persons. So that ends this part. Thank you very much for listening, and please stand by for the next part of this presentation, which is on freedom and self-determination. Thank you very much for listening. Stay safe and God bless.